It was a bright, sunny morning when Harold, an 81-year-old veteran, entered his usual diner. He was a man of few words, always calm and composed, with a look that spoke of years spent in difficult places. The old wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, letting in the warm air of the early spring day. Inside, the diner was familiar. The smell of sizzling bacon, freshly brewed coffee, and the comforting noise of people chatting filled the space. It was one of those small diners where everyone knew everyone, and the waitresses greeted you by name. Harold walked up to the counter, nodding to the owner, Betty, who was wiping down a table. She waved him over, her face breaking into a smile. "The usual, Harold?" she asked, already pulling out a mug for him. Harold smiled back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He'd been coming to this diner for years, ever since he moved back to this small town. It was his quiet retreat, a place where he could enjoy a warm meal and a peaceful moment away from the busy world. He took a seat at the counter, glancing around as he always did. A few familiar faces were sitting at the other stools, sipping coffee or reading the newspaper. It was a slow morning, the perfect time to enjoy a quiet breakfast. As he settled in, Harold ordered his usual 2 eggs, over easy, with a side of toast and bacon. The sounds of the kitchen in the back were comforting, the sizzle of eggs in the pan and the clatter of plates being set down. It felt like home. But today, something felt off. A man entered the diner, and the atmosphere immediately shifted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with tattoos running down his arms. His leather jacket creaked as he pushed the door open with a grunt. He walked in with the confidence of someone who was used to being noticed. The man's boots thudded against the floor as he made his way to the counter, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the scene with an air of arrogance. Harold noticed him immediately. There was something about the man that just didn't sit right. He looked like the type who was always looking for trouble. The man sat down a few stools away from Harold, the leather of his jacket creaking as he lowered himself onto the seat. The waitress, Linda, walked over to him. "What can I get you?" she asked, smiling as she always did, though there was a hint of caution in her voice. The man grunted, scanning the menu before his eyes locked onto Linda's. "Just coffee," he said sharply, his voice rough, as though he hadn't bothered to soften it. As Linda turned to get his coffee, the man noticed Harold sitting quietly, his military cap resting on the counter. He looked at Harold for a moment, a smirk spreading across his face. "What's an old man like you doing here?" he asked loudly, his voice carrying across the diner. The customers at the other tables looked up, a few frowning at the man's tone. Harold, however, didn't flinch. He simply continued sipping his coffee, as if he hadn't heard the question at all. But the biker wasn't done. "You've got that hat on," he said, motioning to Harold's military cap. "You some kind of war hero or something?" He leaned in a little closer, the smirk still on his face, waiting for a response. Harold remained calm, his face expressionless as he placed his coffee cup back onto the saucer. "I served," he replied quietly, his voice steady, not giving the man any more attention than he deserved. The biker chuckled to himself, clearly amused. "Yeah, sure. You look like you've been serving coffee for the last 30 years. What are you, some kind of washed-up soldier?" At this, the diner fell silent. The few people still eating their breakfast looked over, unsure whether to intervene. Betty, who had been busy behind the counter, stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "Mark," she said firmly, "that's enough. Show some respect." But the biker, Mark, wasn't listening. He looked over at Harold again, his grin widening. "Respect," he scoffed. "Respect for an old man who probably spent his days sitting on his butt waiting for a paycheck." Harold's grip tightened slightly around his coffee mug, but his face remained calm. He'd seen worse than this. He'd been through wars, faced danger, and survived things that most people could never imagine. The last thing he needed was to get into a shouting match with some young punk who didn't understand the meaning of respect. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Without warning, Mark reached out and slapped Harold hard across the face. The sound of it echoed through the diner, loud and sharp. For a moment, everything was still. Betty's hand froze mid-air as she was about to grab a cup. Linda gasped, her eyes wide in shock. The other customers looked up in disbelief. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Harold didn't react. He didn't raise his hand, didn't shout. He didn't even flinch. He simply wiped his mouth with a napkin, as though it had been nothing more than a gust of wind brushing against him. The slap hadn't hurt him, at least not physically. What hurt was the disrespect, the thought that a man like Mark could think that it was okay to treat someone like that, especially a veteran who had fought for this country. The other customers in the diner were still in shock, unsure of what to do. Betty stepped forward again, her voice trembling with anger. "Mark, you need to leave. Now." But Mark was already laughing, his loud, brash laugh filling the room. "Whatever, lady. I'm just having some fun." He turned his attention back to Harold, shaking his head. "Old man, you're lucky I don't do worse." Then he shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, clearly satisfied with his actions, and settled back onto his stool, ignoring the growing tension around him. Harold didn't say a word. He simply stood up slowly, adjusted his hat, and walked toward the door. As he passed by Betty, he gave her a small nod, silently acknowledging her concern. But there was no need to speak. The slap hadn't been a fight, it had been a challenge. And Harold, for reasons known only to him, wasn't going to rise to it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. He just quietly walked out of the diner, his boots making soft tapping sounds against the pavement outside. Inside, the diner was still silent, everyone trying to process what had just happened. But Mark, sitting there with a smug look on his face, was too lost in his own thoughts to notice the way the customers were beginning to look at him differently. His moment of triumph had come, but the consequences, he didn't know yet, would soon be on their way. Harold stepped out of the diner, the door creaking behind him as it closed with a soft thud. He took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh morning air. The cool breeze felt good against his skin, especially after the heated moment inside. But it wasn't just the slap that had him thinking. It was the look in Mark's eyes, the complete lack of respect for someone who had given so much for this country. Harold had seen a lot of things in his life, but this felt different. This wasn't just a young man being rude. This was something deeper, something that made Harold question how much people really valued the sacrifices of others. He walked down the street slowly, his steps deliberate, as if nothing had happened. It wasn't that he was afraid of confrontation. Harold had faced far more dangerous situations in his life than a rude biker. It was simply that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The years he spent in service had taught him the value of patience, of knowing when to speak and when to walk away. Today, he had chosen the latter. Harold reached the small house he had lived in for years. It wasn't much, but it was home. A modest little bungalow with a well-kept garden and a white picket fence. It was the same place he had returned to after he left the military, the place where he had raised his children and watched his grandchildren grow up. The house was filled with memories, some good, some not so good, but they were all part of the story of his life. As he stepped onto the porch, Harold took a moment to look at the old, tattered flag that hung from the front of the house. It was his flag, the one he had fought under all those years ago. The fabric was worn, but it still fluttered proudly in the breeze. Harold ran his hand over it, the rough material reminding him of the days when he was younger, full of energy and ambition, ready to take on whatever the world threw at him. Those days seemed so far away now, but the memories were always there, just beneath the surface. Harold went inside and sat down in his favorite chair by the window, a spot where he could watch the world go by. He had always been the quiet type, preferring to observe rather than engage in conversation. But today, he couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he couldn't let Mark's disrespect go unanswered. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was only one person who could help him in this situation: his son, Ryan. Ryan had always been the kind of person who believed in standing up for what was right. He had grown up hearing stories about Harold's time in the military, about the battles he had fought and the sacrifices he had made. But Ryan wasn't just a man of words. He had his own set of values, his own sense of honor, and he wasn't afraid to fight for what he believed in. Harold picked up the phone and dialed Ryan's number, his fingers pressing the familiar buttons with ease. He waited as the phone rang, his mind racing with thoughts of how to explain what had happened. He didn't want to worry his son, but at the same time, he needed to make sure that Mark understood the gravity of what he had done. On the other end of the line, Ryan picked up after the second ring. "Hey, Dad, what's going on?" His voice was warm and familiar, a comforting sound that always made Harold feel at ease. Harold took a deep breath before speaking. "Ryan, I need to tell you something." His voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind it. "Something happened at the diner today." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "A man, a biker, slapped me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Harold could almost hear Ryan processing the information. Finally, Ryan spoke, his voice tight with anger. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Harold replied. "But he disrespected me, and I couldn't just let it go. I want you to know what happened, because I need you to handle this." Ryan didn't say anything for a moment. Harold could imagine him pacing back and forth, the way he always did when he was upset. "Dad, I'll take care of it. I'll make sure he understands exactly who he messed with." Ryan's tone was steady, filled with the kind of resolve Harold had always admired in his son. Harold smiled faintly, grateful for Ryan's willingness to help, but he knew this wasn't going to be easy. "You don't have to do anything drastic, Ryan. I just want him to understand what it means to disrespect a veteran." "I'll do more than that," Ryan said, his voice hardening. "You don't mess with my father and get away with it." "I'll be there soon." Harold knew that Ryan wasn't the type to back down. He had served in the army for several years and had earned the respect of everyone he met. But what Ryan didn't know was just how far Mark was willing to push things. Harold hoped his son could handle the situation without making it worse, but he also knew that sometimes, a person had to make a stand, even if it meant doing something a little extreme. Before hanging up, Ryan promised he would be at Harold's house as soon as he could, and that he would bring a few friends along to help. As soon as the conversation ended, Harold sat back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He didn't want violence, but he knew Ryan's connections, especially in the military, could bring the kind of pressure that might make Mark realize the seriousness of what he had done. This wasn't about revenge, it was about teaching respect, about showing that actions have consequences. Meanwhile, in the diner, Mark was still sitting at the counter, blissfully unaware of what was coming. He was talking loudly to anyone who would listen, laughing and acting like nothing had happened. To him, Harold was just an old man, someone who was easy to mock and disrespect. But what he didn't know was that, in just 22 minutes, his life was about to change. Mark's arrogance and his complete disregard for another person's dignity were about to come face to face with something far more powerful than he could have imagined. Back at Harold's house, time seemed to slow as he waited. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and all he could do was sit there, thinking. He had never been one to ask for help, but in this moment, he knew that Ryan's arrival was the only thing that could settle this. Harold didn't care about the biker's apology, he just wanted him to understand the cost of disrespect. He wanted Mark to know that some things couldn't be taken lightly. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence outside. Harold stood up slowly, his old joints creaking as he made his way to the door. He opened it just as Ryan's car pulled into the driveway. Ryan stepped out, tall and confident, his military training evident in his posture. Behind him were a few of his friends, men and women who had served with him, each one carrying the same sense of purpose. Ryan gave Harold a brief, reassuring smile before turning to face the road. The stage was set. The lesson was about to be taught, and Mark was going to learn exactly what happens when you disrespect a veteran. The air felt heavy with anticipation as Harold sat back down in his favorite chair, his hands resting on the armrests. It had been only a few minutes since he hung up the phone with Ryan, but those minutes felt like hours. His mind kept racing, replaying the moment in the diner when Mark slapped him. The slap itself wasn't the issue. Harold had faced far worse during his time in the military. It was the disrespect, the disregard for everything Harold had sacrificed for this country, for the people in this very town. That was what bothered him the most. As Harold sat there, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't fear or anxiety. It was the calm of someone who had already fought battles, someone who knew that the greatest strength came not from acting on anger but from patience. Harold knew he didn't need to do anything more. Ryan would handle it. He had always trusted his son, ever since he was a boy, to stand up for what was right. But what did Ryan think about it? Harold wondered. His son had always been a man of action, someone who believed in fighting for justice, but this wasn't just about fighting for the right thing. This was about respect. Would Ryan be able to keep his cool, or would his own anger get the best of him? The phone rang, breaking Harold's thoughts. He jumped slightly, not expecting it so soon. He looked at the caller ID and saw Ryan's name. It had only been 20 minutes since their conversation, but Ryan was always quick to act. Harold picked up the phone. "Hello." "Hey, Dad," Ryan's voice came through, steady but with an edge to it that Harold could recognize immediately. "I'm on my way." Harold smiled faintly. He could hear the determination in Ryan's voice, but he also heard the tension. "I know you're upset, Ryan. But don't go in there looking for a fight." "I won't," Ryan said, his voice firm. "But I want to make sure that guy knows exactly what he did. He's going to understand that there are consequences for disrespecting a veteran. And, Dad, for disrespecting you." Harold's chest tightened at those words. Ryan's loyalty had always been something that made Harold proud, but it also made him worry sometimes. "I don't need any trouble," Harold said softly. "Just, talk to him. Let him know he can't treat people like that." "I'll make sure he understands," Ryan promised. "I'll be there soon." As Harold hung up the phone, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Part of him was proud of Ryan for being the man he had become, a strong and compassionate person who wouldn't stand by while someone was wronged. Another part of him, however, was worried. He didn't want anyone to get hurt. He didn't want Ryan to make a rash decision out of anger. But deep down, Harold knew that Ryan's sense of justice would guide him. He had always been that way, ever since he was a child. The minutes ticked by slowly. Harold watched the clock on the wall as it seemed to move at a crawl. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. His mind wandered to the past, to the days when he was younger, when he was the one who had stood up for others. When he had made the hard decisions, fought in the wars, and defended those who couldn't defend themselves. He remembered the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself, of knowing that his actions had consequences for the world around him. It had been a long time since he had felt that way. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway brought Harold back to the present. He opened his eyes, his heart skipping a beat. It was Ryan. Harold stood up slowly, his old joints creaking as he made his way to the front door. He opened it just as Ryan's car came to a stop in the driveway. Ryan stepped out, his tall frame casting a shadow over the yard. Behind him, Harold could see a few of Ryan's friends, people he had served with in the military. They were all strong, capable individuals, but they weren't here for a fight. They were here for something far more important: respect. Ryan gave his father a quick nod as he approached the door. "You good?" he asked, his eyes scanning Harold's face for any sign of distress. Harold smiled, trying to reassure him, though he knew it wasn't necessary. Ryan was the one who needed reassurance. He had always been the protector, always the one who took charge. It was part of who he was. "I'm fine, son," Harold said quietly. "But I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" "Don't make this worse than it needs to be. Just talk to him. Make him understand." Ryan's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "I will. I know what I'm doing. Don't worry about me. I've got this." Harold looked at Ryan for a long moment. His son had grown up to be a man he could be proud of. A man who valued justice and honor above all else. And yet, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that the biker, Mark, wouldn't back down easily. He didn't know Mark personally, but there was something about the way the man carried himself that made Harold uneasy. He could feel the tension in his bones, the knowledge that this confrontation wasn't going to end the way they hoped. Ryan turned to his friends, giving them a few brief instructions. "Stay close," he said. "We'll handle it calmly, but I want to make sure he knows that this isn't just about disrespecting my father. It's about showing respect for all veterans, for everyone who's served." The group of soldiers nodded, all of them silent but resolute. They had seen the ugliness of the world, the cruelty of people who thought they could get away with anything. And they knew, deep down, that this was more than just a man slapping an old veteran. It was a symptom of a bigger problem: a lack of respect for the people who had fought for this country, for the sacrifices they had made. As Ryan and his team made their way to the diner, Harold stood in the doorway, watching them go. He didn't want to be part of this, but he knew it was inevitable. The anger that had bubbled up in Ryan was something that couldn't be ignored. It was the kind of anger that only came when someone you loved had been wronged, when the lines of respect had been crossed. The walk to the diner felt long, even though it was only a few blocks away. Ryan's steps were steady, his mind focused on the task ahead. He wasn't worried about the fight. He was worried about the message that needed to be delivered. He knew that, in the end, this wasn't about physical confrontation. It was about teaching a lesson. A lesson that Mark would remember long after this day was over. The diner was busy now, the lunch rush slowly filling up the small space with the sounds of chatter, clinking plates, and the sizzle of food cooking in the kitchen. Mark was still sitting at the counter, nursing his coffee, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. He was talking loudly, laughing and joking with the other customers around him, thinking that he had won. To him, the slap he had given Harold was just a moment of fun, a way to prove that he was in control. But there was something he didn't understand. Something that would soon make him regret that moment. Ryan and his group of friends arrived outside the diner, their steps in perfect unison as they approached the door. There was no rushing, no sense of panic. They walked like soldiers on a mission, focused and deliberate. The tension in the air was thick, but they didn't show it. Ryan took a deep breath as he reached for the door, pushing it open with purpose. The familiar bell above the door chimed as they stepped inside, the warmth of the diner contrasting sharply with the chill that had settled around them. Every eye in the room turned toward them, some recognizing Ryan and his friends, others simply wondering what was going on. Ryan's gaze immediately found Mark, still sitting at the counter, his back to the door. Mark was in mid-sentence, laughing at something someone had said, but the laugh caught in his throat when he saw Ryan and his group entering. The atmosphere in the diner shifted. It wasn't just the arrival of a few people, it was the arrival of something serious, something that demanded attention. Ryan moved through the room with confidence, his posture straight, his eyes focused. He wasn't here to start a fight, but he was here to make sure that Mark understood the weight of his actions. His friends followed closely behind, a group of quiet, capable individuals who had seen the worst of the world and weren't intimidated by someone like Mark. The group made their way toward the counter, the space between them and Mark closing quickly. Ryan's footsteps were steady, each step purposeful as he approached the stool where Mark sat. Mark finally noticed them, his eyes flicking nervously from Ryan to the soldiers behind him. The laughter from the other customers slowly died down, replaced by the low hum of anticipation. Mark's cocky smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "What's this?" he asked, his voice dripping with false confidence. "You boys looking for a fight?" Ryan didn't flinch. He stopped just a few feet from Mark, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "I'm not here to fight," Ryan said, his gaze steady. "I'm here to make sure you understand what you did." Mark scoffed, trying to brush off the situation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, clearly trying to act tough, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What's the big deal?" "It was just a slap." "A slap," Ryan repeated, his voice steady. "You think it was just a slap?" The room was silent now, everyone listening in, some of the customers watching with bated breath. The waitress, Linda, stood frozen, her hands hovering over the coffee pot. No one knew what would happen next, but they could feel the tension building with every passing second. Ryan took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. "It wasn't just a slap," he continued. "It was a disrespect to my father. And it was a disrespect to every man and woman who has served this country, including you." Mark's expression shifted. For a moment, his bravado wavered, and Ryan could see the uncertainty growing in his eyes. But Mark wasn't ready to back down. He leaned forward on his stool, his fists tightening around his coffee cup. "I don't need a lecture from some guy who thinks he's tough because of his old man," he muttered. Ryan's friends, standing behind him, didn't move. They were there to make sure nothing escalated, but they were also there to back up their friend. They understood the seriousness of the situation. They knew the value of respect, and they could see that Mark didn't have any. "That's the problem," Ryan said, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge. "You don't understand respect. You don't understand what it means to treat people with dignity, especially people who have given so much for this country." Mark's face reddened, his hands shaking slightly now. It wasn't fear that caused him to tremble, it was the realization that he had crossed a line. A line that, in his arrogance, he hadn't even considered. "So what, you think I'm supposed to apologize?" he spat, his voice rising. Ryan didn't flinch. "An apology would be a good start," he said simply. "But it's more than that. It's about understanding the cost of disrespect. Understanding that not everyone in this world has had the luxury of acting like they own it. Some of us have fought for it." Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room tensed, and for a moment, it seemed like the situation was about to explode. But Ryan held his ground, not moving, not backing down. Mark's eyes flickered toward the door, considering whether to walk out. But then, as if realizing that leaving wouldn't fix anything, he turned back to face Ryan. "I didn't mean any harm," Mark muttered, his voice lower now. "It was just a joke." Ryan's eyes softened slightly, but the seriousness of the moment remained. "It wasn't a joke. It was an attack on my father's honor. And that's something we don't take lightly." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Now, I'm going to ask you again. Apologize." For a long moment, Mark didn't say anything. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the biker to either back down or make another move. Finally, Mark let out a deep sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out slowly, like he was forcing them from deep inside. "I didn't mean to disrespect him. I was out of line." Ryan nodded, his gaze still steady. "Good. That's all I needed to hear." He turned to his friends, giving them a slight nod. The tension in the room began to lift, though it was still there, lingering in the air. Ryan turned back to Mark one last time. "Remember this, respect isn't something you just get. It's something you earn. And you've got a long way to go before you earn mine." With that, Ryan and his friends turned to leave, their presence still commanding the room. As they walked out, Harold's eyes met Ryan's for a brief moment, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. Harold didn't need words to understand what had just happened. The lesson had been taught. Mark would think twice the next time he decided to disrespect someone. The door closed behind them with a soft chime, and the diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But something had changed. The air felt lighter now, as if the weight of the moment had been lifted. Mark, still standing by the counter, let out a long breath. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't be messing with veterans again. As Ryan and his friends walked out of the diner, the door closed softly behind them, and the sounds of the busy lunch rush slowly crept back into the air. The clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, and the sound of coffee being poured back into mugs filled the room again. But something was different. The atmosphere had shifted, like a heavy fog lifting after a storm. There was a sense of calm, of resolution that hadn't been there before. Mark, still standing by the counter, let out a long sigh. His hands were still shaking, but it wasn't from fear anymore. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure: the moment he had with Ryan and his friends wasn't something he would forget. For a brief moment, Mark had been faced with a side of life he hadn't fully understood, a side where respect mattered more than anything else. The other customers in the diner slowly started talking again, but there was an air of respect in the way they spoke. They had witnessed something real, something that wasn't about fighting or yelling, but about standing up for what was right. The lesson had been clear, and the respect that had been shown to Harold in that moment was something they all could feel. No one in the diner would forget what had just happened. Meanwhile, outside, Ryan and his friends stood by the cars, their expressions calm but resolute. The tension that had been building up for hours was finally gone. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, looking at the diner for a moment before turning to face his friends. "That's what it's all about," he said quietly, though his voice still held the strength of someone who had just made a stand. "Respect." One of his friends, Ben, who had served with Ryan during their time in the military, nodded in agreement. "You didn't back down. You showed him that some things can't be joked about." His voice was steady, filled with the understanding of someone who had fought for the very respect Ryan had demanded today. "I just hope he learns something," Ryan replied, looking back at the door. "I don't want to cause trouble, but he needed to understand why that wasn't okay." "You did the right thing," said Lisa, another friend who had served with Ryan. "Sometimes, people need to see that their actions have consequences. And that apology, if it was even real, was just the start." Ryan nodded slowly. "Yeah. I'm glad it ended without anyone getting hurt. But the message was clear. Disrespecting someone who's been through what my dad has, and what so many others have, isn't something anyone should ever take lightly." As Ryan stood there, his mind still processing the conversation, he glanced over at his father's house, which wasn't far from the diner. He could feel a sense of pride for his father, for the way Harold had handled the situation. It wasn't the first time Ryan had seen his dad take the high road. Harold had always been someone who chose his battles carefully, and today, He had chosen to remain calm, to walk away and let Ryan do what he needed to do. Back inside the diner, the atmosphere had returned to normal, but there was an undercurrent of respect among the customers. Mark, still standing by the counter, looked down at his coffee cup, lost in thought. The few people who were still seated didn't say anything, but the way they looked at him had changed. They had seen what had just happened. They had seen the way Ryan and his friends handled the situation with maturity, with calmness, and with dignity. They had seen Mark's apology, and whether or not it was genuine, they knew it meant something. Mark's hand still trembled as he reached for his cup, his fingers barely gripping the handle. He didn't know what had come over him. The cocky attitude, the joking around, the sense that he could do whatever he wanted, it had all felt so easy. But when Ryan had walked in, when his friends had stood by him, everything had shifted. He realized just how out of his depth he was. He had underestimated the power of respect. It wasn't just about the slap anymore. It wasn't just about a moment of arrogance. It was about the things Mark had taken for granted, things like the sacrifice of people who had served, who had given years of their lives to protect others. Mark had been blind to that before, but now, something had changed inside him. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, he had learned a valuable lesson. Harold, meanwhile, sat quietly at home, reflecting on the events of the day. He had heard the car pull into the driveway earlier and knew Ryan had arrived. He had chosen to stay out of it, to let his son handle the situation. There was a part of him that wanted to rush to the diner, to stand with Ryan, but he knew that wasn't the right approach. He had learned, over the years, that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. Sometimes, standing back and letting others take the lead was the best way to show respect. As the evening began to settle in, Harold sat in his chair, looking out the window at the setting sun. It had been a long day, filled with tension and uncertainty, but now, there was peace. Ryan had done what needed to be done. Harold had taught him well the importance of standing up for what was right, even if it meant facing challenges along the way. At that moment, Harold heard a knock at the door. He stood up slowly, walking over to answer it. When he opened the door, he saw Ryan standing there, a small but genuine smile on his face. Ryan didn't say anything at first. Instead, he just stepped inside and wrapped his father in a brief, tight hug. Harold smiled, patting Ryan on the back. "You did good today, son," he said softly. Ryan nodded. "I hope he understood," he replied. "I hope he learned something." "I think he did," Harold said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "Sometimes, all you need is someone to show you the way." Ryan stayed for a while, the two of them talking about the events of the day, reflecting on the lesson that had been taught. Neither of them spoke much about Mark or what had happened in the diner. They didn't need to. What mattered was that respect had been earned, not through force or anger, but through understanding and the willingness to make a stand. As the evening drew to a close, the two of them shared a quiet moment, knowing that the day had been about more than just an apology or a confrontation. It had been about showing the value of respect, about teaching that some lines shouldn't be crossed, and about honoring the sacrifices of those who had given so much for others.